please.
Wow.
One more thing. You need to get your parents to buy you raffle tickets because we have signed sets of his book and the artwork he does tonight. He's going to sign and you can take one home. So, you know, get on your parents. Big time.
Hi everyone, how are you doing tonight?
Good!
Thank you so much for having me here, Pages. Thank you very much. I wanted to tell you kids, you know, this is a benefit for Access Books, as Becky said, and they do great work. They build libraries for people who can't ordinarily afford to have nice books in their library. So I just want to say thank you so much for parents. I know the price tag was very high, but it's going to a very good cause. So thank you very much. Kids, give your parents a round of applause. So, what's that? I caught you talking. So I'm very excited to be here tonight. I thought that I would tell you a little bit about my journey to become a children's author because it really kind of happened on accident for me. It didn't happen on purpose. I didn't want to become a children's author. What I wanted to become was a newspaper cartoonist. How many people here remember newspapers? Right? Okay, they still have some. They're around, right? But I wanted to be a newspaper cartoonist, and I love cartoons like Calvin and Hobbes. Have you guys heard of them?
Oh, yeah.
The Far Side, still a little bit, parents?
Yeah.
I love that book.
And I love the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics from long, long ago. So those are my very favorite cartoons. I wanted to be a newspaper cartoonist. So when I went to school, I went to Villanova University, and I started my own cartoon. It was called Igdoof. And I'm going to show you what Igdoof looked like. Okay? So there was Igdoof. He looks kind of rough, right? But I drew this character that was bug-eyed, and he had a big ear and big lips, and he also had like 3 little hairs on his head, right? And it's strange, actually. There's a long history in cartooning of... I'm not sure what's going on there. It's a special effect for my speech. But for some reason in cartooning, there's a long history of bald or nearly bald boy characters. I don't know why. But the very first cartoon character was called the Yellow Kid. And he came out in 1893. And here's what he looks like. Right, the Yellow Kid. It's kind of frightening. You wouldn't want to find him under your bed, right? But that was... He looks a little bit like Caillou, doesn't he? You guys remember Caillou? So that's the very first cartoon character. His name was the Yellow Kid. And so there's been lots of characters. Henry, Ziggy is a character. I guess he's a man, but he's bald. There's been lots of them. Can anybody tell me who the most famous nearly bald cartoon boy is? Yes?
Charlie Brown?
Charlie Brown, that's right. So let's go advance on that slide. So Charlie Brown, for some reason, he has just one little squiggle of hair up front. And I think I know the reason why cartoonists do this. I think that the reason is because they want you to know that that's their main character. So they want him to really stand out. And that's why I did it for Igdoof. I created this character, his name was Igdoof, it was a funny name, but I really wanted you to know who the main character was when you just took a look at my cartoon. And so what happened was I took Igdoof with me from Villanova University to the University of Maryland. And here you can see that Igdoof actually changed a lot. Sometimes with cartoons, they sort of take a while to find their form, right? It takes a while for the cartoonist to figure out what the character should really look like. So Igdoof's ear got much bigger, his nose got much bigger, his lips got bigger, but one thing stayed the same, is that he had 3 little hairs coming out of the top of his head. And when Igdoof drew himself, he drew himself looking a little bit better, right? He drew himself with a perfectly round head and a button nose and not giant lips, right? And so can anybody guess what he looked like when he drew himself? Yeah?
Greg Heffley?
He looked like Greg Heffley, right? So let's take a look at that. So here's Igdoof drawing himself, and you can see that Greg Heffley, or at least in this form, has been around for more than 20 years. So he's been around for a long while. But while I was drawing cartoons in college, I decided that what I wanted to do was send my comic strips off to real cartoonists, people who were really published. And so I sent my comic strip to a bunch of creators, including Lincoln Purse, who does the Big Nate books. You guys have heard of them? How many have heard of Big Nate? Good number. Good number. Yeah. That's a very good. It was a very good comic strip, and I'll show you one of the comics. So these strips started to show up in my hometown paper, the Washington Post. I think it looks a little bit like Calvin and Hobbes, and it's got its own thing going, but I really like the style and I like the humor. So I wrote to Lincoln Purse and I said, what can I do better? Let me ask, let's do questions at the very end, okay? I want you to...
I don't know what book that is.
Oh, you know what that's from?
Yeah, it's from Go for Broke.
Go for Broke, very cool. So, Big Nate, I really liked it, and the cartoonist actually wrote me back, right? He said, and he started writing letters to me, right? So let's take a look at that, one of his letters. And kids, letters are these things that people used to write back and forth. Yeah, you know what letters are? You sure? You fold up the piece of paper, you put it in an envelope, stamp, all that. You seen them? Really? Well, we used to write letters, that's right, and we would write back and forth, and it would take about 6 weeks to make a complete transaction. So we wrote lots of times back and forth, and Lincoln Purse showed me how I could get better as a cartoonist. So it was great for him to take the time to write to one of his fans and to show him how to get better as a cartoonist. So you can see here, he was showing me how to give my words more space, which is very important in cartooning. So what happened was this one day, my younger brother, Patrick, he called me up and he said, Jeff, you've got to look at today's Washington Post. Look at Big Nate. And so I did. I looked at the Sunday comics. And I was like, what am I supposed to be looking for here? And I looked very closely at the page that Nate is holding, right here. And he had drawn, Lincoln Purse had drawn a sticker sheet that his character, Nate, was holding. And it had on it a sticker of my character, Igdoof, right? So this was a really big deal to me. It was like the most exciting moment of my life. Here on this tiny little spot, and I'll blow it up here so you can see it better, Lincoln Purse had drawn my character, Igdoof, along with Garfield and Bart Simpson, right? So these very famous cartoon characters. So I was so excited because I felt like I had arrived as a cartoonist. My character had showed up in the Washington Post, which was like the biggest deal in the world to me. And so I kept writing. I was very inspired by this, and I kept writing in college, and I worked on my cartoons for a few more years, and eventually I got some attention for my strip by the Washington Post. And so here's a picture of me, age 22. Let me see if I can recreate the pose. I was very cocky, right, looking like that. I was looking very happy because the Washington Post told me that Igdoof was going to be a really big deal, that it was going to be the next big cartoon. Now, had you guys ever heard of Igdoof before this moment? No. Well, that tells you that Igdoof was not the next big thing in cartooning. And in fact, between the time that this picture was taken and the time I had anything else published at all, it was 14 years. So it was a long time in between. In the meantime, when I started sending out my strips to newspaper syndicates, I got lots of these, right? And this is a rejection letter, right? And if there are any kids in here or adults that want to be writers, artists, musicians, you can expect to get rejected a lot before you get accepted if you're really aiming high. So for most writers, for most book authors, it takes about 5 years of rejections before you finally get a bite, if you're lucky enough to get a bite. And so what my problem was, though, it wasn't that I wasn't a good enough writer, it was that I wasn't a good enough illustrator, right? I knew all along that I couldn't illustrate at a professional level. So I said, what do I do about this? I sort of am drawing like a kid, in a way, and I want people to accept my work, but what can I do about this? So I came up with this idea that I would draw like a kid on purpose and make it seem like I was doing it on purpose. So I came up with this character, Greg Heffley, who has a journal, and he draws like a kid. And so that's where the idea for Diary of a Wimpy Kid came from. It was in 1998, I got this idea, I said, I'm going to write this book called Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and I wanted to just grab a piece of paper and start writing my book, right? But what I did instead was I said, I'm going to actually get a blank sketchbook and fill it up with ideas, and then I'll start writing my book. I'll take the best of those ideas and then start writing my book. So here's the very first page of my blank sketchbook. And you can see that a lot of the characters are being born on this page. I'll step away from the mic here. So here's Rowley. Here's another picture of Rowley, and a third. Here's Greg, a very early version of Greg. He has a really big head. Yeah, and somebody noticed Nasty Pants, right? That's a villain. That's a villain that doesn't show up until the 6th Wimpy Kid book. So I came up with all of these ideas, and things were going pretty well. But as I went along, I started writing smaller and smaller, right? And I don't think I really realized it at the time, or at least at first. But I think what I was afraid of was that I was writing too quickly and I wasn't going to have enough good ideas for a book. So by the very end, this is what my very last idea page looked like. And if you can see that computer screen right there, that's about actual size. You don't have to move it, but that's about actual size. So I'm 41 now, and I wouldn't be able to read what I wrote on that page. It's kind of sad. Something happens when you turn about 38. But the types of stories that I was writing, or the types of ideas I was putting down on the page, were things that happened to me as a kid, right? I always tell kids, it's like, my books are not special. It's not about a boy wizard or vampires or anything like that. These are just ordinary stories about an ordinary kid. And so I think you guys, like out there, you're probably much more extraordinary than I was. But all of the funny things that are happening to you in your lives, I would really recommend you write them down, because that's where I got all my ideas for Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And here's one of the ideas that came from real life. When I was a kid, I was on the swim team, right? I grew up in Maryland. You're on the swim team. It was very cold in the morning, right? So I'd go and hide out from my coach in the locker room. I'd say, you know, I need to use the bathroom, and I'd go hide in the locker room, and I'd be very cold. Do they still wear Speedos, boys?
No.
No, not really? Okay. So we had to wear Speedos, so I was extra cold. And eventually I did what any normal kid would do, and I looked around to see what I could use to keep myself warm. So these are some of the ideas. This is where Greg Heffler was born, really, on that toilet stall in Maryland, unfortunately, the Wimpy Kid. But as I was writing all this time, it took me 4 years to fill up my idea book, and it took me another 4 years to write my first draft of my book. And all that time, I mentioned to you at the very beginning here that I didn't become a children's author on purpose. I was actually writing for adults, because all this time I was thinking comics or cartoons are for grown-ups, because my dad, you know, subscribed to the Washington Post and opened up the comics page, and I always thought of cartoons as being for older people. And so when I was writing Diary of a Wimpy Kid, I wasn't thinking of kids at all, which is really strange, and now especially to be talking to kids. But here was the very first cover of my book. So you can see it looks kind of boring. It looks like a day planner, right? This is something that an adult might have or might have had like 10 years ago, which is kind of a way to, you know, plan out your business week. And so this was the very first concept for the book. And here's where we eventually landed when my publisher told me, they said, you know, I found a publisher basically, and they said, well, the good news is we're going to publish your book. The bad news is we're going to publish it for kids. And I was like, whoa. And I did not see that coming. Of course, I thought about it. I was like, well, my books are really my book is really G-rated anyway. I think it might work for kids. And so cartoonists love to hide messages in their cartoons. And we hid a few different messages in this cover of this book. You can see that the primary colors are black, white, yellow, and red, right, with a spot of blue. But that's a shout out to Maryland, where I grew up. That's the Maryland State flag's colors. If you guys just saw the Super Bowl, the Maryland State flag was on the, Super Bowl might be a sore subject around here, right? Let's go. Sorry. I'm a Patriots fan myself, but anyway. So those are the state flag colors, but there's another message here, and I'm wondering if any adult can get this. If you stripped away all the effects of the book, if you were just left with the gold type on the red book, it would look very similar to a book that you probably had to read in high school. Can anybody guess? I heard it. That's right, Catcher in the Rye. Did you know that? I hate that book, a fifth grader said. I would too. But Catcher in the Rye is a book, it's about a character named Holden Caulfield, who's very critical about people around him. He complains about the people around him, but he's also very flawed. And we thought that Greg Heffley was sort of like Holden Caulfield, was that he's a very imperfect character. He's not a hero. But I wanted to show you, the book has now been published in 40 different languages. I wanted to show you some of those books in different languages. So can we have the next slide? Thanks. So here's the Korean version, right? This is the Greek version. The Hebrew version, which is, it's the only book that's printed from right to left, right? Yes?
Me and my brother can actually read some Hebrew.
You can read some Hebrew, so you would read it from right to left. That's pretty cool. So here's the Japanese version.
Oh yeah,
That's right. It looks very different. And the characters are drawn a little bit differently, right? If you look at their hands, they have 5 fingers, right? They have 5 fingers, and that's unlike the US version. In fact, most cartoon characters have 4 fingers, because in cartooning that's kind of enough, right? But in Japan, there's a group of people that was discriminated against, and they were called all sorts of awful names like the 4-finger people. And to this day, you're not allowed to draw human beings with 4 fingers. So they asked if they could add a 5th finger to each. So it's pretty funny. I said, well, how is the Simpsons runs in Japan, right? And those characters have 4 fingers. And they say, yeah, well, those aren't really human beings. They're Simpsons. So that's why they have 4 fingers, right? They're kind of yellow. Who knows what they are? But here's another cover. This is one of my favorites. It's Greg's Tagebuch von Idioten am Singel, right, which is the German version, and they called it Greg's Journal I'm Surrounded by Idiots, which is a better title than Diary of a Wimpy Kid, I'm embarrassed to say. And I said, well, why don't you just call it Diary of a Wimpy Kid in your country? And they said, there is no word for wimp in German. So, I'll show you this last cover here. This is Diary of a Banana.